Inspector Purbright arrived in Alderwick on a morning that had decided without enthusiasm to be dry. The village lay in a condition of respectable attentiveness, as though it had been warned in advance that it might be observed. Windows were clean, paths swept, and nothing moved quickly enough to suggest purpose. Purbright approved of this. Villagers that hurried were inclined to invent reasons for doing so. The matter which had summoned him was not, officially, a matter at all. No crime had been alleged, no property reported missing, and no blood, symbolic or otherwise, had been shed. What there had been was correspondence. The chief constable had forwarded it with a penciled note suggesting that, while it was probably nonsense, it had achieved a tone. Purbright understood tones. They were often more reliable than facts. St. Jude's Chapel stood slightly apart from the village centre, as though maintaining a polite independence. Its door was closed, its notice board tidy. The vicar, the Reverend Lionel March, awaited Purbright inside, with an expression carefully assembled to convey calm concern without enthusiasm. Tea had already been poured, implying both welcome and a desire to limit the duration of events. "I am grateful you were able to come, Inspector," said March, offering a chair that had clearly been offered many times before. "I fear we may have allowed a small misunderstanding to become, well, discussed." Purbright inclined his head. "Discussion, in my experience, rarely remains small without encouragement." March smiled thinly, pleased by the remark, but unwilling to pursue it. He explained with appropriate vagueness that a parishioner had been seen entering the chapel late in the evening. This had occurred more than once. It had been noticed. Notices, as he delicately implied, had followed. "And this parishioner," Purbright said, "is Mrs. Hawes?" "Yes." "Mrs. Eleanor Hawes, a widow, quite respectable." Purbright accepted the tea. "Respectability," he said, "is usually the first thing to be defended." March gave a cautious laugh, then clarified that no one suspected Mrs. Hawes of impropriety. The concern, rather, was for appearances. Chapel keys were not issued casually. Night visits suggested irregularity. Irregularity suggested questions. Questions, March agreed, were tiresome. Mrs. Hawes lived in a narrow house not far from the green. Purbright walked there after leaving the chapel, observing that several curtains shifted with an enthusiasm that stopped just short of embarrassment. Mrs. Hawes answered the door herself. She was neatly dressed, as if expecting callers she had not invited. "Inspector Purbright," he said, "may I come in?" She considered this briefly, then stepped aside. The sitting room was orderly to the point of restraint. Nothing appeared decorative, without purpose. She offered tea, which he declined, and sat opposite him with her hands folded. "I understand you have been visiting the chapel in the evenings," Purbright said. "Yes," she replied, "I have." She did not elaborate. Purbright waited. Silence, he knew, often performed the labor conversation avoided. "I go to sit," she continued. "I find it quiet." "And this quiet," Purbright said, "is apparently unsettling." Mrs. Hawes allowed herself a small smile. "Quiet can be misunderstood." She explained that her husband's memorial plaque faced the altar, and that she found comfort in its familiarity. She had not asked permission to visit at night because she had not been asked not to. This, she felt, was an important distinction. Purbright noted her phrasing carefully. "Has anyone spoken to you about these visits?" "No," she said. "People have been kind." He did not doubt it. Kindness, in villages like Alderwick, was a flexible instrument. After leaving Mrs. Hawes, Purbright attended a meeting of the parish council, which had already begun to congratulate itself on its restraint. Concerns were raised, immediately softened, then withdrawn. Someone suggested changing the locks, then apologized for having done so. Mrs. Hawes's name was mentioned less often than her status. "She has been through a great deal," said one councillor, with the satisfaction of having said something humane. "Yes," said another, "one must be careful." Purbright observed that care, in this context, appeared to mean avoidance. No one proposed speaking directly to the widow. Letters were mentioned instead. Letters could be revised. As the meeting concluded, Purbright noticed that the minutes recorded nothing of substance. This, he reflected, was likely deliberate. What was not written could not be recalled. That evening, as he prepared to leave Alderwick, Purbright walked once more past the chapel. The door remained closed. The building looked unchanged, quietly confident in its innocence. He considered how little disturbance was required to unsettle a settled place. Somewhere nearby a curtain moved again, this time without apology. Purbright paused, then continued on. He had the distinct impression that Mrs. Hawes's visits were not the cause of the village's discomfort, merely its occasion. The question, as yet unasked, was what Alderwick preferred not to remember. Inspector Purbright spent the morning in Alderwick's parish office, a room whose principal achievement was to look continuously occupied while accomplishing very little. It smelled faintly of paper that had outlived its purpose. The parish secretary, Miss Harriet Cole, presided over it with an air of restrained vigilance, as though disorder were a moral failing rather than a practical inconvenience. She had been expecting him, not officially but in the way villagers expected things once they had begun talking about them. "These are the letters," Miss Cole said, indicating a neat stack tied with string. "Copies, of course. We keep everything," Purbright approved. Institutions that kept everything were rarely forced to understand any of it. He loosened the string and began to read. The letters were masterpieces of circumlocution. No one accused Mrs. Hawes of anything. No one even admitted to concern. Instead, they worried gently about optics, precedent, and the possibility of misunderstanding. Several writers congratulated the council on its discretion, which Purbright took to mean inertia. "She has always been conscientious," Miss Cole offered, as though prompted by the silence. "Yes," Purbright said. "That word often precedes disagreement." Miss Cole smiled, uncertain whether this was praise. She explained that Mrs. Hawes had once been heavily involved in parish affairs, particularly the Chapel Restoration Committee. Her departure from that role had been described at the time as amicable. "At the time," Purbright repeated mildly. Miss Cole adjusted a paperweight. "Well, yes, there were different views." He asked to see the newsletters from that period. Miss Cole produced them with visible relief. Newsletters were safer than letters. They had been written for public consumption and thus contained nothing dangerous. One edition included a short paragraph praising Mrs. Hawes for her steadfast discretion and careful stewardship. Purbright read it twice. The compliment, he thought, had aged oddly. Discretion was often admired most when it ceased to be exercised. Later that afternoon, Purbright paid a call on Mr. Bernard Linton, former parish treasurer. Mr. Linton lived in a house whose furnishings suggested long-standing negotiations between thrift and pride. He received the inspector with formal politeness and a certain anticipatory tension. "I don't suppose I can be much help," Mr. Linton said promptly. Purbright assured him that help was not a requirement, merely an option. This seemed to relax Mr. Linton slightly. They spoke of accounts, of modest sums redirected with proper authorization. "Nothing improper," Mr. Linton insisted, though his insistence arrived fractionally too soon. "It was all within the rules," he said. "It's just that some of us felt—" He stopped. Purbright waited. "That some matters were better left as they were," Mr. Linton concluded. Purbright asked which matters. Mr. Linton replied that it was difficult to say now. Time had clarified nothing, but had made disagreement impolite. As Purbright left, he noted that Mr. Linton locked the door behind him with unnecessary firmness. In the evening, the inspector dined at the village hotel, a place that specialized in meals designed not to offend. He listened to neighboring conversations that never quite reached content. Mrs. Hawes's name surfaced occasionally, always accompanied by a lowering of voices and a declaration of sympathy. "She's had a hard time," someone said. "Yes," replied another. "Still, rules are rules." Purbright reflected that rules were often invoked after discomfort had already been felt. As dusk settled, he walked again toward St. Jude's Chapel. The building was unlit, its windows dark. He did not intend to enter. Instead, he stood across the road, observing the stillness with professional interest. After some minutes, a figure appeared at the far end of the path. It was not Mrs. Hawes. The man paused, looked toward the chapel, then continued on without approaching. Purbright recognized him as one of the parish councillors, a man who had spoken warmly of compassion that morning. The inspector made no note of this. Notes were for conclusions. Instead, he stored the image away, alongside the letters, the newsletters, and the careful silences. When he returned to his room later, he reread the correspondence once more. One letter, unsigned, referred obliquely to something best left undisturbed. It offered no explanation, only concern. Purbright folded the letter and set it aside. He suspected that whatever lay behind Mrs. Hawes's night visits was less troubling than the village's determination to manage its memory. The question increasingly was not why she went to the chapel, but what others feared she might remember if allowed to remain there too long. Inspector Purbright had not intended to call on Mrs. Hawes again so soon. He was aware that repeated visits could acquire a significance of their own, particularly in a village where significance was manufactured as carefully as preserves. Nevertheless, the previous evening's observations had unsettled him in a manner he found instructive. When a place took such pains to appear settled, it was usually because something had shifted, however slightly, beneath the surface. Mrs. Hawes received him with the same composed courtesy as before. If she was surprised, she did not display it. The sitting room remained unchanged, as though its arrangement had been ratified long ago and was no longer open to appeal. "I hope I am not intruding," Purbright said, a phrase he rarely meant but often found useful. "Not at all," she replied. "It is kind of you to return." Kindness, he reflected, was again doing a great deal of work. They spoke first of neutral matters, the weather, which continued to perform adequately, the village fete, which had been postponed for reasons no one wished to articulate. Mrs. Hawes listened attentively, offering agreement where it was expected. Only when the conversation appeared to have exhausted itself did Purbright incline his head sly and return to his purpose. "I have been looking through some parish records," he said. "They speak of your former involvement with the chapel." "Yes," she said. "I was involved for many years." "And you stepped down," Purbright continued, "by mutual understanding." Mrs. Hawes considered this. "That was the phrase used. Did it correspond to your understanding?" She smiled faintly. "I understood that it would be easier for everyone." Purbright did not ask who everyone included. He had learned that such questions were rarely answered directly. She explained that the Restoration Committee had been a source of mild disagreement toward the end. Not about money exactly, nor about process. Rather, about emphasis. Some things, she said, were considered better forgotten. Others, she believed, required acknowledgement. Memory, she added, is often regarded as optional. Purbright asked whether her evening visits related to this difference of opinion. Mrs. Hawes did not reply at once. Instead, she rose and crossed the room to a small side table, upon which rested a leather-bound album. She opened it carefully and removed a folded sheet of paper. "This was once displayed in the chapel," she said, handing it to him. It was a photograph of a small plaque, its inscription formal and restrained. It commemorated a donation made decades earlier by a man whose name Purbright recognized vaguely, though he could not immediately place it. "It was removed," Mrs. Hawes said, "during the last phase of restoration. Quietly, without announcement, and you objected," Purbright said. "I questioned," she corrected. "Objecting implies resistance." "I did not resist," he returned the photograph. "And now you visit the chapel to see that it has not been entirely erased." "Yes," she said. "At night, it is easier to see what remains." There was no bitterness in her tone. If anything, she sounded relieved to have explained herself. Though she did not appear to expect understanding, Purbright thanked her and prepared to leave. At the door she paused. "Inspector," she said, "may I ask you something? Of course, do you believe," she said carefully, "that a thing ceases to exist once it has been made inconvenient?" Purbright considered this. "I believe," he said, "that inconvenience is often mistaken for resolution." She seemed satisfied with this, or at least willing to accept it. Later that afternoon, Purbright walked to the chapel once more, this time in daylight. The building appeared smaller by day, its authority diminished by familiarity. Inside, the air was cool and faintly dusty. He walked slowly, noting the arrangement of plaques and memorials, each placed with apparent neutrality, in a side alcove. Partially obscured by a floral arrangement that had seen better weeks, he found the plaque from the photograph. It had been rehung, though not prominently. Its presence was neither announced nor denied. As he stood there, the vicar entered quietly behind him. "I wondered if you might find that," Reverend March said. "You wondered," Purbright replied, but did not mention it. March inclined his head. "It seemed unnecessary." "Unnecessary to whom?" The vicar smiled, a gesture that conveyed both agreement and evasion. "We try not to dwell on the past, Inspector. It can be divisive." Purbright looked again at the plaque. "So can its absence." March said nothing to this. He adjusted a prayer book on a nearby pew, aligning it with unnecessary precision. As Purbright left the chapel, he noticed the same parish councillor from the previous evening standing across the road. The man nodded politely but did not approach. His expression suggested mild embarrassment, as though he had been caught attending to something he preferred not to acknowledge. Purbright walked on, reflecting that Alderwick's discomfort did not stem from fear of scandal. but from fear of recollection. Mrs. Hawes's night visits had disturbed a carefully maintained agreement that certain matters once tidied away would remain so. The question now forming was not what Mrs. Hawes did in the chapel, but how many others were quietly ensuring they did not have to do the same. Inspector Purbright spent the morning attending what was described to him as an informal gathering of the parish council, though it had been scheduled, minuted in advance, and provisioned with biscuits. Informality, he had learned, was often a matter of tone rather than structure. The meeting took place in the church hall, whose windows admitted light with an enthusiasm that suggested nothing was intended to be concealed. The councillors greeted Purbright with the cautious warmth reserved for necessary professionals. Chairs were offered and declined with ceremonial insistence. Conversation settled briefly on the weather before drifting, as if by accident, toward Mrs. Hawes. "No one is suggesting she has done anything wrong," said Mrs. Caldwell, who chaired the council with an air of practiced moderation. "It's simply a question of propriety." "Propriety," Purbright repeated gently, as though testing the word's weight. "Yes," she said. "One must consider how things appear." Purbright observed that appearances had already been considered at some length. What interested him more was the unanimity with which this consideration was expressed. Each councillor nodded at the appropriate moments, even when nodding seemed unnecessary. The discussion turned to the plaque, though not by name. It was referred to as that matter or the earlier arrangement. One councillor recalled that its removal had been generally agreed upon. Another said she had no memory of objecting, which she offered as evidence of consent. Purbright asked whether any dissent had been recorded. "Well," said Mr. Hargreaves, adjusting his spectacles, "we didn't think it needed recording." "Because it was insignificant," Purbright suggested. "Because it was resolved," Mr. Hargreaves corrected, with faint defensiveness. Purbright made no comment. He had noticed that resolution, in Alderwick, tended to occur without discussion, provided everyone agreed not to discuss it. When the meeting concluded, Mrs. Caldwell lingered behind, ostensibly to gather papers. In practice, she appeared to be waiting. "You must understand," she said quietly. "We are trying to protect the chapel." "From what?" Purbright asked. She hesitated. "From becoming a subject." Purbright left the hall shortly thereafter, walking toward the green with deliberate unhurriedness. He was joined, after a moment, by Miss Cole, the parish secretary, who seemed to have arranged her departure with care. "I hope this business will be settled soon," she said, her tone implying both hope and expectation. "Business," Purbright said, "has a habit of settling itself only when no one interferes." Miss Cole smiled uncertainly. "It's just that people have been uneasy. About Mrs. Hawes. About talk," she corrected. "Talk has a way of spreading." Purbright asked whether the plaque's donor had been a subject of talk in the past. Miss Cole stopped walking. "That was a long time ago," she said. "Before my time, but not before the village," Purbright said. She nodded reluctantly. It was decided not to dwell on it. That afternoon, Purbright visited the local library, a modest room presided over by a woman who treated silence as a professional obligation. He requested old editions of the parish newsletter, working backward through the years until he found a brief announcement regarding a donation made with gratitude and discretion. The donor's name, Ma. Shed that on the plaque. Further reading revealed several months later a carefully worded notice expressing regret over misunderstandings connected to certain benefactions. No details were provided. Purbright suspected they had been unnecessary. As evening approached, he returned once more to St. Jude's Chapel, arriving just before dusk. He did not enter. Instead, he sat on a bench across the road, observing the gradual dimming of the windows. After some time, Reverend March emerged from the chapel, locking the door behind him. He paused when he saw Purbright, then crossed the road with measured steps. "I trust you are finding what you need," the vicar said. "I am finding," Purbright replied, "that the village is very adept at managing discomfort." March smiled faintly. "We prefer harmony, even when it requires omission." March did not answer immediately. "Some omissions," he said at last, "are acts of kindness." Purbright watched him depart, reflecting that kindness was rarely distributed evenly. As darkness settled, Purbright remained seated. He did not expect Mrs. Hawes to appear. He was more interested in who else might. After several minutes, a light flickered briefly inside the chapel, then went out. The door did not open. Purbright noted the detail without interpretation. He rose and walked back toward his lodging, aware that Alderwick's unease had little to do with nocturnal visits and everything to do with daylight recollection. The plaque was not the problem, it was merely the reminder. The village, he concluded, was less concerned with what Mrs. Hawes remembered than with the possibility that she might insist others do the same. Inspector Purbright spent the following morning with the parish accounts, a task undertaken at the suggestion of several people who had clearly hoped he would not accept it. The ledgers were kept in a small cupboard adjoining Ch.E. vestry, their spines aligned with a conscientiousness that suggested moral as well as financial tardiness. Reverend March produced the key without comment, though his manner implied that the request had been noted. "These are quite in order," the vicar said, as though anticipating a judgment. "I rarely find disorder where order is most advertised," Purbright replied, opening the first ledger. The accounts were, in fact, exemplary. Figures were balanced to the penny, annotations precise and restrained. Expenditures were justified with language that conveyed both prudence and restraint. It was, Purbright thought, the sort of record that invited confidence and discouraged inquiry. He noted, however, a series of small adjustments made some years earlier, each accompanied by a brief explanation and the initials of the treasurer. Funds allocated to roof repairs had been redirected to interior restoration. The sums were not large, but their consistency suggested intention. Purbright asked Reverend March about these changes. "They were approved," the vicar said. "By the committee, and were they questioned?" "Briefly," March replied. "There were differing views, which were resolved," Purbright said. "Which were resolved," March agreed. Later that day, Purbright sought out Mrs. Caldwell, the council chair, at her home. She received him in a sitting room whose furnishings appeared to have been selected for their capacity to reassure. She spoke readily about the village's desire for harmony and its pride in communal effort. "The restoration was a success," she said. "Everyone contributed." "And everyone agreed?" Purbright asked. She smiled. "Agreement is sometimes retrospective." He asked her about the redirected funds. Mrs. Caldwell acknowledged them with a slight tightening of her expression. "There was a suggestion," she said, "that certain features of the chapel deserved attention." "Suggested by whom?" She hesitated. "By Mrs. Hawes's husband originally. He was quite persuasive, and Mrs. Hawes supported him." "Yes," Mrs. Caldwell said. "Naturally." Purbright noted the word. "Naturally," he repeated. Mrs. Caldwell explained that Mr. Hawes had been a man of strong principles and limited patience. He believed the chapel should acknowledge all benefactors, regardless of later discomfort. This view, she admitted, had not been universally shared. It caused unease, she said. People worried about associations, reputational ones, Purbright suggested. "Exactly," Mrs. Caldwell said, with relief at being understood. Purbright left with the impression that Mr. Hawes's death had simplified matters considerably. That afternoon he visited Mr. Linton again, this time with the ledgers in mind. Mr. Linton was less guarded than before, perhaps reassured by the inspector's evident lack of alarm. "It was all proper," Mr. Linton said. "I signed off on it." "But you disagreed," Purbright said. Mr. Linton looked uncomfortable. "I felt the timing was unfortunate." "Because of the donor?" Purbright said. "Yes," Mr. Linton replied. "Or rather, because of what people remembered about him." Purbright asked what that was. Mr. Linton demurred, citing hearsay and old grievances. Eventually he conceded that the donor had been involved in a scandal of sorts, long since resolved but never quite forgotten. "Resolved how?" Purbright asked, by not mentioning it. Mr. Linton said. As Purbright walked back through the village, he reflected that Mrs. Hawes's night visits were an intrusion into this carefully maintained silence. They suggested persistence, memory, and an unwillingness to accept the convenience of forgetting. That evening he encountered Mrs. Hawes by chance outside the post office. Their exchange was polite and brief. She remarked that she had received no further communication from the parish council. "They are considerate," she said. "Consideration," Purbright replied, "can take many forms." She looked at him steadily. "Do you think they will ask me to stop?" Purbright considered this. "I think they would prefer you to decide for yourself." She nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. As they parted, Purbright noticed Miss Cole watching from across the street, her expression one of mild concern. When their eyes met, she smiled quickly and turned away. Later, alone in his room, Purbright reviewed his notes. The pattern was clear enough: a village that had agreed, tacitly and comfortably, to forget an awkward benefactor, a widow who declined to forget, and a series of polite maneuvers designed to preserve harmony without addressing its cause. What remained unclear was whether Mrs. Hawes intended her visits as an act of remembrance or of quiet defiance. The distinction, Purbright suspected, mattered less to Alderwick than the fact that she persisted at all. As he prepared for bed, he reread one entry in the ledger, a marginal note initialed by Mr. Hawes himself. It read simply, "To be retained." Purbright closed the book, wondering how many people in Alderwick now wished that instruction had been ignored, and how far they might go to ensure it would not be repeated. By the 6th day of his stay in Alderwick, Inspector Purbright had acquired the agreeable invisibility granted to those who neither hurry nor linger. His presence was acknowledged with courtesy, and then, as far as possible, disregarded. This suited him. People who forgot they were being observed were often more revealing than those who remembered. He spent the morning in the company of Mrs. Penfold, the village postmistress, whose premises combined postal efficiency with social surveillance. Mrs. Penfold possessed a voice carefully trained ever to sound inquisitive, a discipline she maintained even when inquiring. "I expect you've found us very quiet," she said, sliding a stack of envelopes into their slots with professional exactitude. "I have found," Purbright replied, "that quiet is rarely accidental." Mrs. Penfold smiled, uncertain whether she had been complimented. She remarked that Mrs. Hawes had always been a regular correspondent, particularly after her husband's death. Letters arrived and departed with steady reliability. People wrote to her, Mrs. Penfold said, to express sympathy. "And now?" Purbright asked. "Less so," she replied. "Grief, I think, has its season." Purbright asked whether any letters had arrived recently from the parish council. Mrs. Penfold paused, then selected her words with care. "Nothing official," she said, "though I believe drafts were prepared." Drafts, Purbright reflected, were often the most honest form of communication. In the afternoon, he attended evensong, not out of piety but out of habit. The congregation was modest, arranged with studied irregularity. Mrs. Hawes sat near the back, her posture attentive without devotion. She sang quietly, precisely on key, and did not linger afterward. Purbright observed that several parish councillors attended as well, though they avoided proximity. Politeness here was expressed through distance. After the service, Reverend March approached Purbright with an air of professional concern. "I trust you are finding our parish cooperative," the vicar said. "I am finding it conscientious," Purbright replied. "Cooperation implies direction." March inclined his head. "We are anxious not to overstate matters." "Anxiety," Purbright said, "is rarely overstated." The vicar suggested that Mrs. Hawes might benefit from reassurance. He did not specify what form this reassurance should take. Later that evening, Purbright encountered Miss Cole. Again, this time near the notice board by the green. She was adjusting a posting advertising the postponed fete. "It will be rescheduled," she said quickly. "Once things settle." "What things?" Purbright asked. She hesitated. "It's difficult to say." Purbright suggested that difficulty often indicated proximity to the truth. Miss Cole laughed politely, then said, "People worry that Mrs. Hawes is insisting." "On what?" Purbright asked. "On remembering," Miss Cole said before she could stop herself. She flushed slightly, then added, "It's not that we object to memory, only to emphasis." That night, Purbright walked past the chapel once more, though he did not expect to see anything new. He had learned that Alderwick's disturbances were subtle, preferring implication to demonstration. As he approached, he noticed the door was ajar, only slightly, enough to suggest recent use but not invitation. He did not enter. Instead, he stood for a moment, listening. There were no voices, no movement. The chapel resumed its stillness with convincing promptness. As he turned away, he saw Mrs. Hawes standing a short distance down the path. She did not appear surprised to see him. "I thought I might come earlier," she said, without explanation. "Earlier than usual," Purbright said. "Yes," she replied. "It seemed advisable." They stood in silence for a moment, the chapel between them like a neutral party. "Have you been asked to stop?" Purbright asked. "No," she said. "I believe they are waiting." "For what?" "For me to decide," she said. Purbright considered this. "And have you?" She looked toward the chapel. "I am deciding," she said. Slowly, he nodded. Decisions, he knew, were rarely improved by haste. As Mrs. Hawes walked away, Purbright noticed Reverend March observing from the far side of the green. The vicar did not approach. He merely watched, his expression thoughtful rather than and troubled. Purbright returned to his lodging with the sense that Alderwick was approaching a conclusion it would not articulate. Whether Mrs. Hawes ceased her visits or continued them mattered less than the fact that the village had allowed the responsibility to rest with her. The question now, quietly pressing, was how long such responsibility could be borne by one person alone, and what would happen if she chose not to relieve the village of it. Inspector Purbright awoke to the sound of the village making itself useful. Alderwick was not noisy, but it possessed a capacity for purposeful murmuring, as though each task were accompanied by a quiet commentary on its necessity. From his window he observed Mrs. Caldwell directing two men in the placement of chairs outside the hall, an activity apparently undertaken without a meeting to justify it. Order, he reflected, often preceded explanation. His first engagement of the day was with the chapel cleaner, Mrs. Dawkins, a woman whose familiarity with sacred spaces had rendered her immune to reverence. She worked efficiently, with no particular interest in symbolism. "I clean what I'm told to clean," she said, adjusting her gloves. "I don't ask why things are where they are." "Do you notice when they change?" Purbright asked. She considered this. "Only if it makes my job harder." He asked about the side alcove. Mrs. Dawkins nodded. "Someone's been moving the flowers. Not me. Recently, last week, and before that." Purbright thanked her. She seemed pleased to have been consulted, though she added, almost as an afterthought, "It's not wrong, of course, just unusual." Unusual, Purbright noted, was often the village's threshold for concern. Later, he attended a small luncheon hosted by Mrs. Caldwell, ostensibly to discuss fete arrangements. The conversation rarely touched the fete. Instead, it circled gently around Mrs. Hawes, her fortitude, her sensitivity, her need for rest. Each remark was phrased as consideration, though none were directed to her. "We wouldn't want her to feel pressured," Mrs. Caldwell said, buttering a roll with deliberate care. "Pressure," Purbright said, "can be applied without force." Mrs. Caldwell smiled politely, choosing not to engage. After luncheon, Purbright found Mrs. Hawes in her garden, trimming hedges with restrained determination. She greeted him with a nod and continued her work until he spoke. "They are being very kind," she said before he could ask anything. "Everyone has been most understanding." "And you?" Purbright asked. "Are you understanding yourself?" She paused, resting her shears against the hedge. "I am aware," she said, "that I have become a subject." "Yes," Purbright agreed. "Subjects are rarely comfortable." She told him she had received a letter that morning, unsigned but unmistakable in origin. It expressed hope that she was well and suggested that the chapel might benefit from being locked earlier in the evenings. "It was phrased as concern," she said. "I believe it was meant as instruction." "And your response?" Purbright asked. "I have not replied," she said. Silence seemed appropriate. That evening, Purbright attended a parish council meeting convened with suspicious speed. The agenda was brief, the tone conciliatory. Mrs. Caldwell proposed a formal arrangement whereby Mrs. Hawes would be granted daytime access to the chapel for private reflection. This was described as a gesture of goodwill. No one mentioned night visits. "Would this satisfy all parties?" Mrs. Caldwell asked. There was a general murmur of assent. Purbright observed that Mrs. Hawes was not present. As the meeting concluded, Mr. Hargreaves lingered behind. "You must understand," he said quietly, "we are trying to put this behind us." "Behind you," Purbright said, "or behind?" "Mrs. Hawes?" Mr. Hargreaves did not answer directly. "We believe," he said, "that resolution is possible." Purbright walked home as dusk settled, the village adopting its evening composure. Outside the chapel he paused. The door was closed, the windows dark. He was about to move on when he noticed a small object on the step, a folded piece of paper, weighed down by a stone. He did not pick it up immediately. Instead, he looked around. The street was empty. He retrieved the paper and unfolded it. Inside was a single sentence, written in a careful hand: "Some things are not improved by daylight." Purbright folded the note and placed it in his pocket. He did not know who had written it, though he suspected the author believed anonymity to be a form of protection. As he turned away, he saw Mrs. Hawes standing across the road, watching him. She made no attempt to cross. Their eyes met briefly, then she nodded once and walked on. Purbright remained where he was for a moment, longer, considering the note and the nod. The village had offered Mrs. Hawes a compromise, framed as kindness. Whether she would accept it remained uncertain. The question now, quietly insistent, was not whether Alderwick could restore its equilibrium, but whether Mrs. Hawes intended to assist in the process, or whether she had already decided that some balances, once disturbed, ought not to be corrected too quickly. Inspector Purbright observed the villagers' decision before it was formally announced. Decisions in Alderwick had a habit of becoming visible through behaviour first, a softening of tone, a redistribution of confidence, the return of small certainties. By the time the parish council met to ratify its conclusion, the conclusion itself had already been rehearsed in private conversations and relieved silences. The meeting was notable chiefly for its brevity. Mrs. Caldwell opened proceedings by expressing gratitude for everyone's patience, a remark that assumed its own justification. She then outlined the proposed arrangement concerning Mrs. Hawes's access to the chapel, framing it as an act of pastoral generosity rather than administrative necessity. The wording was careful, suggesting inclusion without concession. It seems appropriate, she said, to recognize her long-standing connection with the chapel, while also ensuring consistency. Consistency, Purbright repeated quietly. Mrs. Caldwell nodded. We must think of the parish as a whole. No one dissented. Purbright noted that agreement was achieved not through enthusiasm but through relief. The matter, it was hoped, would now settle itself. After the meeting, Reverend March walked with Purbright toward the green. The vicar appeared lighter, as though a weight had been redistributed rather than removed. I believe this will be for the best, he said. For whom? Purbright asked. March smiled faintly. For everyone. Purbright refrained from asking whether Mrs. Hawes shared this belief. He suspected the answer would be provisional. That afternoon, Purbright called on Mrs. Hawes to inform her of the council's decision, though he suspected she already knew. She received the news with measured composure, listening without interruption. So I may visit during the day, she said. At hours agreed in advance. Yes, Purbright said. It is intended as a courtesy. She nodded. Courtesy is a useful language. And your evening visits? He asked. She considered this. They have not been mentioned. Do you take that as omission, Purbright said, or instruction? She smiled slightly. I take it as preference. They spoke briefly of other matters. As he prepared to leave, Purbright noticed a stack of letters on her hall table, all unopened. He did not comment. That evening the village resumed its routines with renewed enthusiasm. Lights appeared in windows at expected times. Conversations returned to familiar subjects. The chapel, for its part, remained discreetly silent. Purbright walked past it just after dusk, more out of habit than expectation. The door was closed. The side windows reflected the fading light without comment. He paused, listening, then continued on. Later, as he returned to his lodging, he saw Mrs. Hawes ahead of him on the path. She was walking steadily, her posture unhurried. When she reached her gate, she paused, as though aware of his presence, and turned. I have been thinking, she said. Thinking, Purbright replied, is rarely discouraged. Officially, she told him she intended to accept the council's arrangement. Daytime visits, agreed hours, no further disturbance. It was, she said, a reasonable compromise. And your evening visits? Purbright asked. She looked past him toward the chapel. I believe they have served their purpose. Which was? He asked. To remind, she said, and to observe who found the reminder uncomfortable. Purbright inclined his head. And have you observed sufficiently? She smiled, this time without warmth. More than sufficiently. They stood in silence for a moment. The village seemed to hold its breath around them. As Mrs. Hawes went inside, Purbright remained where he was, considering the shift that had occurred. Alderwick had achieved its compromise. Whether it had achieved understanding was another matter. The following morning, Purbright received a copy of the parish newsletter, newly printed. It contained a brief notice announcing the restoration of the side alcove in recognition of historical contributions. The donor's name was included, without commentary. Purbright folded the paper carefully. The village had adjusted its narrative, just enough to accommodate memory without acknowledging discomfort, as he prepared to depart Alderwick. Later that day, Purbright walked once more past the chapel. In daylight, it appeared unchanged, its authority intact. He noticed, however, that the flowers in the side alcove had been rearranged, allowing the plaque to be seen more clearly from the aisle. No announcement accompanied this adjustment. It was, he suspected, intended to appear natural. Purbright paused, then continued on. The matter was, by most standards, resolved. The village would move forward, carrying with it a version of the past that was slightly less convenient but considerably safer. Yet as he reached the station, Purbright reflected that compromises often left questions intact beneath their surface. Mrs. Hawes had withdrawn her disturbance but not her knowledge. Whether Alderwick could remain comfortable knowing that someone remembered, quietly, precisely, was a question that would not be answered by policy alone. Inspector Purbright's departure from Alderwick had been planned with the sort of care usually reserved for arrivals. His train was scheduled for mid-morning, late enough to avoid appearing abrupt, early enough to prevent further consultations. Villagers appreciated finality when it was delivered without emphasis. Before leaving, he paid a last call on Reverend March, who received him in the vestry with an expression of professional calm that had improved noticeably over the previous days. The vicar spoke of routine matters, the forthcoming rescheduling of the fete, the success of recent services, as though these were developments of genuine importance rather than reassuring gestures. "We are grateful for your discretion," March said, pouring tea that neither of them intended to finish. "Discretion," Purbright replied, "is most effective when it is shared." March smiled politely. "I believe we have reached a sensible understanding." Purbright did not dispute this. "Sensible you." Understandings were often achieved when no one pressed for clarity. From the vestry, Purbright walked once more through the chapel itself. Daylight gave the interior a quality of unarguable normality. The side alcove was now openly visible, the flowers arranged with studied artlessness. The plaque, reinstated without ceremony, appeared to have been there all along. This, Purbright reflected, was perhaps the greatest achievement of the council's efforts. As he stood there, Mrs. Dawkins entered with her cleaning trolley. She nodded to him without surprise. "They've decided to leave it then," she said, indicating the plaque with a glance. "So it appears," Purbright said. "Probably for the best," she remarked. "Things don't like being moved too much." Purbright thanked her and stepped outside. On the green he encountered Mrs. Caldwell, who seemed determined to intercept him casually. "I trust everything is settled," she said, her tone conveying hope rather than inquiry. "Settled," Purbright agreed, "is a flexible term." Mrs. Caldwell accepted this with a small laugh. "Villages depend on flexibility." "And memory?" Purbright asked. She paused. "Memory," she said carefully, "depends on context." They parted with mutual politeness. As Purbright walked away, he sensed her watching him until distance made it unnecessary. At the station, he found Mrs. Hawes already on the platform, seated on a bench with a handbag resting precisely at her feet. She did not look surprised to see him. "I thought you might be leaving today," she said. "Yes," Purbright replied. It seemed appropriate. They spoke briefly about trains and timetables, the conversation assuming the shape of departure. When silence settled, it did so comfortably. "You have accepted their arrangement," Purbright said at last. "Yes," she replied. "I see no advantage in prolonging matters." "And are you satisfied?" he asked. She considered this. "I am satisfied," she said, "that the village has reminded itself of what it prefers not to discuss." Purbright inclined his head. "And that is sufficient? For now?" She said. The train arrived with punctual restraint. As they boarded separate carriages, Purbright noticed that Mrs. Hawes carried no luggage beyond her handbag. He wondered briefly whether she intended to travel far. From the window, he watched Alderwick recede into its accustomed composure. The chapel spire remained visible longer than expected, asserting its presence without explanation. Later that afternoon, as Purbright reviewed his notes, he found himself returning to a minor detail he had previously dismissed, the light he had seen flicker inside the chapel after hours, days earlier. At the time it had seemed incidental, a gesture without consequence. He turned this over in his mind, considering who might have cause to visit the chapel quietly, now that Mrs. Hawes had ceased her night walks. The council had achieved its compromise, the plaque restored, the matter concluded. There should, by rights, be no further need for discretion. And yet, discretion had become habitual. Purbright folded his notes and placed them in his case. He suspected that Alderwick would not trouble the constabulary again over this matter. From the village's perspective, the difficulty had been resolved. What lingered, however, was the possibility that Mrs. Hawes's persistence had disturbed more than a single omission. By insisting on remembrance, she had exposed the ease with which the village adjusted its principles to preserve comfort. As the train carried him further away, Purbright allowed himself the thought that resolution was often mistaken for closure. Alderwick had made room for its plaque. but it had not addressed the instincts that required its removal in the first place. The question now, unasked and unanswered, was whether the village would remain content knowing that its silence had been observed, and whether that knowledge, once acquired, could ever be entirely forgotten. Inspector Purbright returned to Alderwick a week later, though this visit carried no official purpose. The village had been left with its compromise, the plaque visible, the widow's visits ostensibly curtailed. Yet he had learned that absence often disguised observation more thoroughly than presence. There was curiosity to be satisfied, questions lingering beyond policy, beyond propriety. He arrived mid-morning, the air still cool, the green bathed in muted sunlight. Windows were opened selectively, curtains drawn with care. The village moved as if performing itself, a subtle choreography designed to demonstrate civility and attention. Purbright noted the familiar patterns, shutters adjusted, hedges clipped, and the cautious spacing between villagers as they passed one another. His first call was naturally on Mrs. Hawes. She received him in her sitting room with the same composed courtesy he had come to expect. Tea was poured but left undisturbed. Their conversation began with neutral topics: weather, letters received, the rescheduling of the fete. As before, she listened and replied with precise economy. "I understand the council's arrangement suits you," Purbright said, gently steering toward the familiar matter. "It is acceptable," she replied. "Daytime access is sufficient." She paused, then added, almost conversationally, "Though the chapel's quiet still offers insights." Purbright inclined his head. "Insights," he murmured, "are rarely public property." She smiled faintly. "Some observations are best left unspoken." He asked if she had received any further correspondence. She shook her head. "Letters are drafted, perhaps, but they do not arrive. Concern is often silent." After their meeting, Purbright wandered through the village. Alderwick had resumed its routine, though a subtle tension underlay it, as if the council's decision had restored appearances without raising memory. He noted the parish notice board, freshly updated. The plaque's reinstatement was mentioned in a brief paragraph, phrased to reassure, devoid of commentary. Beneath the surface, he sensed that acknowledgement and discomfort coexisted in deliberate silence. Later, he visited the chapel. Sunlight through the tall windows created orderly patterns on the floor, light and shadow moving with deliberation. The side alcove drew his attention. The plaque stood unobscured, its restoration precise, the flowers arranged without extravagance. No visitor was present, yet Purbright noticed subtle disturbances in the dust near the edges of the alcove, as if someone had recently been there. He waited, observing. After several minutes, the door opened quietly, and Reverend March entered. The vicar's manner was calm, as though his awareness of Purbright's presence was a customary expectation. "You find the chapel unchanged?" March asked, eyes tracing the lines of the interior. "Orderly," Purbright replied. "Though some evidence of movement remains." March glanced at the alcove. "Ah, perhaps Mrs. Hawes. She has not yet arrived today." The vicar nodded, as if confirming a long-held suspicion. "People leave their mark even when unobserved. It is a quiet habit." Purbright did not respond, choosing instead to note the careful arrangement of hymnals and the modest adjustment of the altar cloth. Small actions, he reflected, often revealed more than letters or formal decisions. When he left the chapel, he encountered Miss Cole outside, arranging notices with meticulous attention. She paused, meeting his eyes briefly. "They are all preparing," she said, voice low, "even when they appear settled." "Preparing?" Purbright asked. "To accept, to manage, to avoid reconsideration." He nodded, observing that the village's harmony was maintained less through resolution than through anticipate. Each citizen performed diligence quietly, policing appearances as much as behavior. As afternoon approached, Purbright returned to Mrs. Hawes's house, not for conversation, but to observe. She was tending her small garden, moving deliberately among the plants. A letter, recently delivered, lay unopened on the table. She made no attempt to retrieve it, though her gaze occasionally flicked toward it. It remained undisturbed, a quiet testament to selective attention. He spoke with her briefly. "Will you open it?" "Perhaps later," she said. "Some things are better left pending." He left shortly afterward, walking through the village with eyes attuned to subtleties. Windows were shuttered or open in patterns, conversations carefully moderated, flowers arranged to suggest diligence rather than pride. Alderwick, he reflected, had returned to its routines. but with an awareness of scrutiny that had previously been unnecessary. Memory, once acknowledged, could not be entirely erased. At the chapel that evening, Purbright paused once more. The door was closed. The light within flickered faintly, as if acknowledging the encroaching darkness. No sound emerged, yet he detected the imprint of presence, a careful adjustment of a pew, the faint scent of recently moved flowers. He realized that even in apparent stillness, the village's habits persisted. Observations had been made, compromises established, but the record remained alive in small gestures. As he departed, he looked back at the spire, its outline distinct against the evening sky. Alderwick had reached a settlement, but Purbright understood that settlements in human communities were rarely absolute. Someone, somewhere, remembered precisely, observed quietly, and ensured that the narrative of propriety remained subtly unsettled. He stepped onto the path leading to his lodgings, noting that Mrs. Hawes had appeared once at the chapel doorway, watching without movement. Their eyes met briefly. She inclined her head almost imperceptibly, neither challenging nor conceding. The gesture was deliberate, quiet, and entirely unspoken, a final assertion that memory, when carefully preserved, might continue to shape perception even after compromise. Purbright made a note in his own mind, not on paper. The village could arrange schedules, restore plaques, and issue formal notices, but it could not remove the awareness of observation. And awareness, once present, had a subtle persistence that would endure long after resolutions were declared. He continued on, carrying with him the understanding that Alderwick's harmony was, in part, a performance, and that the most revealing acts were the ones left unacknowledged, the silent measures that ensured propriety while quietly noting dissent. For Alderwick, memory had become a companion. For Purbright, it was an open question how long the village could maintain its delicate balance before recollection demanded attention again.